Hello, my name is Melissa Romo. Today we are going to be reviewing Matlab's nested loops. A nested loop is when the statements of a loop include another loop. Let's begin with looking at nested for loops. This is the outer loop, the first for loop. The outer loop includes the entire inner loop for each iteration of the outer loop. Let's begin the process. The outer loop is entered and Matlab begins to execute the lines inside of the outer for loop. It begins with statement 1 and then it moves on to the inner for loop. It will execute the entire inner for loop. It will then execute statement 4 and then it will move on to the next index in the range of the outer loop. It will reiterate this process for each index of the outer loop until the outer loop is completed or broken. Let's go over other types of nested loops. Here's nested while loops. There's the outer while loop and the inner while loop. The same process as described here is completed for these loops. You can also mix loops. You can have a for loop with a while loop inside. You can also have a while loop with a for loop inside. Here's a very complex version. You have a while loop with a for loop inside, and you have an if-else statement inside of this for loop. So you have while loop with a for loop inside with an if-else statement inside of the for loop. You also have a second inner for loop. Now that we've discussed some basic formats for nested loops, let's move on to an example. We're going to write a script that will print this multiplication table in the shape of a triangle using nested for loops. The key here is that the number of columns in each row is equal to the row number. So there are 3 columns here because this is the third row from the top. And that's what makes this triangle shape. How do we get this 6 here? Well, that's very simple. We multiply the row number by the column number. 3 times 2 is 6. Let's check the 16 here. It's in the 4th row, the 4th column. 4 by 4 is 16. Now let's use the nested for loops to create this. For I equals, we're going to use this to index through the rows. So because there's 5 rows in this multiplication table, I is going to go 1 through 5 for the rows. The second for loop is going to index through the columns. There's a total at the very end of 5 columns, but we don't want to index j equals 1 through 5 because we want it to be dependent on the row number because the number of columns is equal to the number of rows for each row. So for j, it's going to equal 1 through I. This is going to be through the columns. Now we're going to put inside of here how to get these numbers. So we're going to say that multiplication, which is what I'm calling this number here, multiplication, equals the row number, which is I, times the column number, which is going to be j. Now how do we get it to display in this triangular shape? We're going to use f_f. We're going to say f_f, this number here, with a space so that they don't all combine together. So this variable is multiplication, which is this variable here. And you can make sure that these are matching. You see when I click it, it turns into a blue highlighted color, and they're both highlighted, so you know that these are the same. We're going to end that with a semicolon. So for each row, we're going to have an I amount of columns because the number of columns equals the number of rows. We want to print the number, the multiplication, for each of those columns. And then we want to go to the next row. So we exit the columns for loop. Now we're in the rows for loop down here because we've ended the column for loop. And we're going to do another fprintf to take us down to the next line. So this just means new line. And now we're going to end the row for loop. Now let's run it and see if this works. It's telling me that I have an error in line 12. That's because I have a typo here in line 12. fprintf. Now let's rerun and resize our command window, and you can see that we've displayed this triangle multiplication table just as we wanted here. Now that we've discussed nested loops, here are some assignments to allow you to practice these types of problems. For the first problem, use nested for loops and the pattern described here to create the following triangle of stars. For the second problem, use a while loop inside of a for loop to create a script that meets the following requirements. Down below, there is a hint for problem 2. The nested loops will take this form given here. These two problems will likely take you more time to complete than the previous assignment problems. That is because they're more difficult. Take your time to work through these problems. If you have any questions on these problems or on this topic at all, please come to the next SI session where I will be available to assist you. Thank you so much for watching.